Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Devin Sears. I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Chris Miles, and
Hello.
we are talking today about how to increase your speed for your WordPress website. Anyone that's ever built a website has always had some interest at some point in increasing the load time and the speed of their website. So today we're going to do a deep dive into a bunch of different factors that can play into slowing your website down and how you overcome them so that your website is performant and so that it's loading very quickly. So, as I mentioned, we're joined today by Chris David Miles. He is one of our senior product managers here at Bluehost. He has specifically worked on our server side of things in making sure, and probably more than that, but very simply put, worked on the server side of things to make sure that the Bluehost websites are loading quickly and that all of the servers are provisioned in such a way that they work well and load quickly with WordPress. So we are going straight to the source on this one. I'm very excited about this. We have a deep well of information to share with us today. So real quick, before we get started, a couple housekeeping items. First things first, if you can hear us, tell us where you're tuning in from. Always love to hear where people are joining us from. I have heard some people have issues hearing if they're joining from a mobile device. You might need to click around, find the audio button, and turn the audio up or to unmute us. If you have questions, there is a chat section, but if you have questions, we ask that you put those in the Q&A tab that is right next to chat on this platform. That will help us find those and answer those as the comments come in. I will do my best to respond to as many of those as I can. I'll try to hold a couple questions for the end if I think they're particularly helpful for the group. And if you have any issues with the platform, please drop it in the chat. Let us know. If it's a widespread issue that everyone's experiencing, then we'll try to do what we can to fix it. If it's just you that's having the issue, oftentimes refreshing the screen will resolve most of those issues. Before I am asked this too many times, I will say we are recording this. We will send out the recording and the slides after the presentation, so probably in the next 24, 48 hours. So don't worry if you need to drop early or if you join a few minutes late. We are recording this, and we will be sending out a recording down the road. So housekeeping out of the way, I am going to go off screen so I can focus on responding to comments without me staring off to the side. But Chris, take it away. Teach us all about how we can increase the load time of our websites.
Awesome. So starting out with just a little bit of like why this matters. I mean, we all kind of recognize speed is important. We all want fast websites. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I want a slow website. But being able to translate that to something specific like dollars is sometimes helpful. So if you look at this from like an SEO perspective, there's several studies published, but one of them by Google was that about half of visits are likely to be abandoned if pages take longer than 3 seconds to load. It's particularly true on mobile. 1 out of 2 people expect a page to load in less than 2 seconds. And 46%, so about half of people, say that waiting for pages to load is what they dislike the most when browsing the web on mobile devices. And I'm sure we've all been in that situation before where, that's sometimes the most annoying thing about figuring out how something works is just it takes forever on phones. Something else to think about is website conversion rate drops by an average of 4.4% with each additional second of load time up to 5 seconds. So that's it. That's one that's a little bit easier to translate into dollars if it's like an e-commerce store of like, if you figure out what your conversion rate is, well, that can stack pretty dramatically. There's quite a difference there. So speed is important. But when we're thinking about speed and when we're thinking about the things that we might have to do to get the kind of speed that we need, it's helpful to keep in mind that there's multiple types of performance that matters. And people describe it in different ways, but here I'll describe it as speed and scalability. And here's what I mean by that. So imagine we draw kind of a an axis where we've got on one axis how fast a website loads, just exactly what you would think of just, does it load quickly, does it load slowly? You pull it up on your phone, you pull it up on your computer, is it fast, is it slow? So that's one axis. And then on the other axis, you can imagine how often the website is having to do that. Is this, a site that doesn't get very much traffic? Is this a site that gets an enormous amount of traffic? So you've got low and high amount of computational work that has to happen, low or high scale on another axis. So if we think about it this way, if you've got a website, imagine, that's fast when you just pull it up and there's only one hit, that's great. But what you really want is a website that stays fast, even if you're getting a lot of traffic, right? So imagine an impossibly performant website that's just, no matter how much traffic you throw at it, has every server in the world, would look like this on a chart, where the line doesn't move at all, even when you add more and more traffic to infinity. In real life, websites tend to perform more like this, where they're fine at first, and then the more and more traffic that you add, the worse and worse the performance gets, right? And even websites like Google and Yahoo and Reddit and things like this can have problems at scale with enough things happening at once. And then one thing to keep in mind is this is all of these charts assuming that your website started out fast, because it actually does get worse than this, which is if your website starts out not really fast, even just on one page load, well, then it's going to be even worse when we're talking about throwing dozens of requests per second or hundreds of requests per second and stacking that up and up and up into, maybe the best e-commerce day of a site, ton of traffic, So it's something to keep in mind, that there's speed, which is how fast something loads, and there's scalability, which is how fast it can sustain that load. And if it stays fast. So what are the things that play into this? What are the factors that we should examine, that we should look at? There's a lot of things we could look at. For this presentation, I want to focus on these four: hosting, the themes, plugins, and blocks, images, and minification and caching. And we're going to go into the specifics of these, and we're going to go into what specifically we can look for, how we can test, and what we can do to kind of evaluate them, see where we're at, and make changes if we need to. So let's go through it. Let's start with hosting. So there's a lot of things that you can look at when evaluating the performance of a given hosting provider. But some of the things that I personally like to look at are what types of PHP versions does it support? At minimum, you're going to want to have the latest version and one version older than that. Hopefully, you've got a hosting provider that isn't taking too long on getting the very, very latest version out. And if they are taking a long time getting the latest version of PHP out, that might be a reason to look for another hosting provider, because changing PHP versions is one of those things that you can do that will immediately change not just the speed, but the scalability of your site. So not just it'll load faster, but it'll be able to sustain fast load times under heavier traffic with newer versions of PHP. So if you're not sure which PHP version you have, there's actually a cool little tool built into WordPress core that you can use. If you go into tools and site health inside your WP admin panel, you'll either see something that looks like this. Here I manually set a test server I have to a very old version of PHP just to show you what it looks like. You'll see something that looks like this that says, hey, you're running an outdated version. Or you'll see something that looks like this that says, hey, everything's great. But there's actually a whole list of tests there that are really useful to look at. But one of them is your PHP version. So it's a way you can find out in there what version am I running? And is that version new enough? And if not, definitely see if you can change that within your hosting account. Most hosting providers, basically all of them, give you a way to change your PHP version if you're not automatically on the latest version. Some will just manage that for you and will always just keep you on the latest version. But if they do have multiple versions running, they'll always give you a way to change it. So, and Bluehost is no exception, but that's a pretty common thing. You'll find that basically everywhere. So that's first thing to look at is PHP version. Make sure you're on the latest. Another thing is HTTP2 to see if you have support for that. The thing that's nice about that is lots of times when you're pulling up a website, it's usually more than just one request. There'll be a request for every image on the page, for every bit of CSS, for every individual file, and there's usually dozens of requests for just a single page load. And so what HTTP2 can do for you is it can make it so that you're not having to wait on some of those requests to be able to see the page. And it was able to put the page together in such a way that kind of back and forth of waiting for additional requests is able to be completed much, much faster. So if you're not sure if your hosting provider supports this, there's actually just online tests that you can run that will test it for you. So if you just search for HTTP2 test online, there's a number of different ones online, and you can just search that. If you don't have it turned on, one of the easiest ways to enable this that I'm a big fan of is by using Cloudflare. Cloudflare is a free service. They also have a paid tier. They integrate with most hosting providers, including Bluehost. And it's one of the easiest ways to enable HTTP2, even if it's not natively supported for some reason on the server. So it's a handy thing to have available. CDN capabilities. So there's a number of different approaches to this. Cloudflare is the CDN that I typically recommend because it's able to, it has a lot of security features built into it. It's not just a CDN. But sometimes it's also useful to have an image CDN or a video CDN specific to that. There's different popular ones. Many hosting providers actually partner with the CDN provider to make sure that, even though your server might just be in one location, that you're able to have assets in locations all over the world. So the idea with a CDN is that your server is just in one place. And hopefully that one place is close to a lot of your customers. But what a CDN can do is it can put copies of static assets, things like pictures and things like that. It can put copies of that in servers all over the world so that when a visitor comes to your site, not all of the traffic has to go all the way to your one web server or your web server cluster. It can actually go to whichever server is closest to you. So you can have a CDN with servers on every continent, and then that ends up making things a lot faster when I don't have to go all the way to the origin web server for all of the requests. And so if you're evaluating how performant a hosting provider is, a good way to do that is, do they have a CDN? Do they not? What options are available? That sort of thing. Another one is the caching solution. So you can just go get a caching plugin from WordPress.org. That is an option. Those tend to work really well if you have no other choice. But if you're using a managed WordPress hosting provider where it's more than just generic hosting, where it's a hosting provider that is able to focus on WordPress and has a lot of WordPress expertise and is providing solutions that have been well tested with WordPress, then I would expect there to be a caching solution that integrates with WordPress itself. And so this is something really common. You'll see it with a lot of hosting providers where you'll see a caching plugin put out by a hosting company, right? So you spin up a site at Bluehost, or you spin up a site at another provider, and you'll notice that they add their own caching plugin sometimes specific to that provider. The idea being that they have fine-tuned their server configuration, or maybe multiple servers configuration, to work with that. At Bluehost, the way that it works is we actually have a hardware cluster for running the cache. And so it doesn't have to steal resources from your website to build the cache. So it actually performs really, really well without a third-party caching plugin. Now, if you don't have that, if you're just using very generic hosting, then yeah, you'd have to go find an off-the-shelf caching plugin. But one of the things I would look for when evaluating a hosting provider for WordPress is, hey, how do you solve the caching problem? And what types of caching do you have available? And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on, but let's continue. So those are some things I would look at for hosting. And if there's any additional questions about any of those, put them in the Q&A and we'll try and get to them. Now let's talk about themes, plugins, and blocks. I remember back when it was just themes and plugins, but themes, plugins, and blocks. So here, there's a couple things that you can do, because the theme that you choose, the plugins that you choose, the blocks that you use, those are going to impact not just the speed, but the scalability of your site. Particularly, some plugins make it so that each additional page load will stack on top of each other and are difficult to cache. So one of the most common pieces of advice that you'll get when trying to take a site and make it more performant is try changing the theme, try turning off some plugins and see if it's a lot faster. It's the most common advice you'll see. One of the problems with just taking that as the only advice is usually if you're using a theme, you like the way it looks. And usually if you're using a plugin, you want or need that functionality. And so, how can you address this problem, and how can you identify how much of something is a problem? And so that's where let's talk about some of the things that you can do for that. So one is the health check plugin. So that's available on WordPress.org. You can just install it. And when you do, you'll have an additional tool in your the tools section of WP Admin called Site Health. And when you select that, there'll be additional troubleshooting tools there. It'll let you enter something called troubleshooting mode, which lets you switch to a default theme and disable all plugins, but it'll only happen for you, where other visitors will still see the site like normal. And that's sometimes really useful for troubleshooting, particularly if you want to run some tests on the site yourself in the browser and see where are some of the speed problems coming from. So it's pretty handy. It's something I would recommend, and it can call out problems with themes and plugins sometimes and say, hey, we found this that might be problematic. Maybe look at another theme or another plugin. So that's called Health Check and Troubleshooting. It's available for free. Another one is Query Monitor. I really like using that one. Also free on the WordPress.org repo. What that one does is it adds additional functionality so that you're able to see what is using the database of your site, because the content and the settings are all stored in the database. And in order to get to those settings and in order to get to that content, WordPress has to query the database, and plugins have to query the database, and the theme has to query the database. And sometimes queries can be really, really, really fast, right? But sometimes not. And so one of the things you can do is you can look and you can see, okay, well, which of these queries are really slow? Which of these ones are able to hit a cache? Which ones are not being cached? Which ones are throwing errors? And you can actually step through that and even in many times find out which plugin is causing this, because it'll tell you the file name that's calling it. And you can say, oh, this plugin is generating half of the queries on my site. And it's not even a plugin I think is that important. It's one of the less important ones. Yeah, so you can do things like that, and you don't even have to necessarily read or understand the code. You can just step through it and use this UI tool to identify problems that way. It's really handy. That's called Query Monitor. External testing is when you take your site and then you use an external service to measure something about that site. And we're going to get into more details a little bit later on 2 ways we can do that. GT Metrix and Lighthouse are what I recommend, and we'll get into how to use those in just a bit. So that's themes, plugins, and blocks of being able to identify where some of the problems are. These are things that impact your speed and impact your scalability, and what you can take a look at when you want to improve them. Images and other media. Pictures are good. Pictures are not the enemy. But there are ways we can do this so that you're able to add those big, beautiful pictures to a website without slowing things down dramatically. One of them is called image crunching. And what that is when you upload a picture, the WordPress will process that picture so that it's a smaller file size, but it looks almost the same. And there are plugins that let you change the level of crunching that happens, where maybe if it's like a photography site where all that matters are the photos, maybe you want to use a different algorithm for image crunching, or maybe you want to turn it down slightly. But for most websites, it's probably just fine to turn it up and increase the amount of crunching that happens so that you're able to benefit from a faster site with images that look roughly the same. Lazy loading. What lazy loading does is it's a very clever way of loading assets in a website so that it only loads things when it has to. And only when it waits until the very last second to do it, almost like it's being lazy. And that's where the name comes from, is lazy loading. So the idea here is WordPress core by default, since I think 5.5, will add code to your site that makes it so that images, when properly rendered in a theme, will only actually get downloaded when they're close to being shown on the site. Because if you think of a website and you imagine you have to scroll through the whole site to see everything, and maybe a lot of the site isn't visible at once because you have to scroll through it. Well, if something's not on the page, then that shouldn't block something that is on the page from being shown. And one of the ways that you can reduce the amount of resources being consumed is by only loading things just before you have to. And so you're able to scroll through your site and everything looks normal, but rather than loading everything up front or loading everything all at the same time, you're able to load things only when you need them. And so now that lazy loading is in WordPress core, the only thing we have to do as website owners, running our websites and trying to make them fast, is make sure that we don't have plugins that are accidentally getting in the way of what WordPress core is doing. And so if you just look for a lazy loading testing tool online, there's one built into Lighthouse, and I'll show you how to use Lighthouse in a minute. It's just a thing to watch out for now that it's in WordPress core, to say, hey, good, none of my plugins or my theme got in the way of what WordPress core is doing. Terrific. Video hosting. So you can, in many cases, depends on your hosting provider, but most hosting providers will let you upload video files straight to your web server. But it's usually not recommended because there are services out there and hosts out there that are specific to video hosting that will be able to relieve load off of your web server and serve videos without slowing down your site. So things like Vimeo, things like YouTube, Jetpack actually has one that's pretty good called VideoPress. All of those do a terrific job. And rather than uploading a video to your web server and having an enormous amount of processing and network usage just to pull down a video, all you can do, you can just embed it in a YouTube link or in Vimeo or in VideoPress, and then it doesn't take really any load at all off of your web server. You can have as many videos as you need, and they can all play really well, and it'll do a really good job because something like Vimeo or some of those services will also work like a CDN, and will have copies of that video in servers around the world. And so it'll load faster for your users, and it won't slow down your website. So with pictures, oftentimes you can get away with just putting those on your web server. And it's great to have a CDN, but with videos, it's a lot more important that you're using a provider that is specific to videos, something like YouTube or Vimeo or VideoPress or something like that. There's also others, but those are kind of the three that I've used before. Cool. So that's images and other media. And again, if anyone has questions about any of these things as we're going through it, put it in the Q&A. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. We might have to answer a few of them after. Minification and caching. Okay. So what minification is it's basically just a way to take some code and compress it. And you can compress it in a way that it takes up far less space, and therefore it's faster to download. And it might not make a big difference for individual files, but in aggregate, when you do it to all of your code and as often as possible, the cumulative result over all of the page loads and all of the assets can be pretty big. And another thing that you can do is caching. Caching, if you're not already familiar with it, is just the practice of if generating the output for your site, like what your site looks like, if that's an expensive task, which usually it is, one of the things you can do is you can kind of save that output over and over. The way I think about it is if you save a copy of it and then it's really fast to serve up that copy, that's oftentimes going to be a lot better than every single time generating it from scratch. Like if you think about if you've ever done video recording or anything like that, if you export a video and it takes a long time, but then copying the file once you're done can be really fast. But that first initial export can be expensive. And websites can work the same way, where generating the site can be far more expensive computationally than just serving up a kind of cached copy. And there's different types of caching that will help for different things. Let's talk about some of them. So what page caching is when you save what's on a page in a file cache, right? Or there's different ways to do it, but usually it's a file cache, right? So that's maybe whatever's on your homepage. A copy of that will be saved somewhere so that your website doesn't have to run all of your code in every plugin to figure out exactly what should be there. Every single time there's a page load, we can just do that once and then save a copy, and then that copy is sent off. But that doesn't work all of the time because there are situations where you want a page to be different for everyone. If you think about something like a shopping cart, you don't want to see somebody else's shopping cart. You don't want somebody else to see your shopping cart. So sometimes page caching won't work. And there are situations where certain pages are unable to be cached. And that's not bad. It's just how it works, is that page caching will only take you so far. Another thing you can do is browser caching. And what that is you can have instructions in the code that will tell your site visitors' browsers, hey, you don't have to download, like, because sometimes there will be things that will be common between pages where you'll pull up the home page and maybe it has a logo. And then you'll navigate to another page and that you still got that logo. One of the things you can do is you can say, hey, you don't have to download the logo every time you go to a new page. The logo is the same on every page. And then your browser knows, oh, okay, so every time I navigate to a new page, I don't have to re-download this file. The file is the same every time. That's browser caching. And the idea there is it can dramatically reduce the amount of requests to where maybe the first request, I have to download everything. But every request after that, I'm only downloading the changes, which can be save a lot of resources on your server. And that can help with the scalability, where it might not help with that first page load, but all of the page loads after that, it will help for. And that's browser caching. Object caching. So far the caching we've been talking about is the caching that happens in front of the application. So like basically everything that happens that WordPress generates, like the page, content, things like that. But there's also caching that you can do, what we call behind the application. If you remember back when we were talking about Query Monitor, where your website has to ask your database, has to query the database for different information all the time. That's kind of what this helps with, is it can save on the amount of queries that have to be run. If you've got a site that's making the same, asking the database the same question over and over, sometimes you can cache that. And you can say, you don't actually have to ask the database. We already know the answer. The answer is this. And WordPress has a very good built-in mechanism for caching these, as long as your hosting provider supports it. And so that's another thing to look into. And this can be especially helpful for situations like where regular page caching doesn't work. Remember the example we gave with e-commerce, where, well, I can't save a copy of the cart page and serve that up to every site visitor because the cart page is different for every visitor. So that would be a situation where object caching would help a lot, because you could do things like, oh, well, every time I ask the database, hey, what are all the active coupons right now? The answer to that might be the same for every user. Or, that's just a made up example, but things like that. So that's object caching. It can be very helpful if you've got a hosting provider that supports it. So all of that together those are some of the main factors that affect site speed and affect scalability. One of the things that we talked about before that we said, hey, let's get into later is, how do we actually run some of these tests? We've been talking about doing external testing. How do the tests work? How can we do them? Let's run through some of that. So one of the tests that I like to use is called GT Metrix. And what you can do for that is, let me share my screen and I will just show you some of the things you can do with GT Metrix. So I'm going to use, I'm going to see if it lets me. Let me share my screen. And we will go to GT Metrix here. There we go. Terrific. Okay. Now I'm just going to do example.com to start with, just to get just a quick introduction into this. So I just went to gtmetrix.com, and you would just type in the URL of the website you're trying to test, probably your own website, and it would run through a test. And there's different settings that you can change for this test, but if you've never done it before, just leave it where it's at and you can see where it is. So this is example.com, and if you've never used example.com, it's a very minimal web page. There's not much on it. So it did pretty well. And so here, what we've got is it will give you a breakdown of various specific things about it. one of the things that's pretty useful too is it'll give you a waterfall view where it'll show you. Here, let's use another one that's maybe a lot slower, and we'll get a better example. So I made one for testing that should help a lot. All right. Here's a website that I made specifically for the purpose of being slow. And we can use this to kind of demonstrate, here are the sorts of things you can look for when you test it. So this is a site that I made very slow on purpose. And we can take a look at that. But one of the things that GT Metrix does is it can show you not just the score for various things, but it can show you kind of where things are breaking down, which is useful. So here we have, see, this is more what you would see, a speed visualization, which is, hey, so when people go to this website, the first little while, they're not seeing anything. And the first time they see something is around 2.5 seconds. And then it finally stops loading around 4 seconds. And so this is where, and it'll break down different parts of it. Like, hey, a lot of your homepage is images. Maybe that's something that could be reduced. And then it starts giving you scores on these individual things. And I'll talk about what some of these things are. So time to interactive. Have you ever used a website? This is particularly important on phones. Have you ever used a website where you pull up the site, you load the site, and while it's loading, you can't click on anything, you can't scroll, and it's super obnoxious? Okay, that's what time to interactive is trying to measure, is how long until I can click on a link, how long until I can interact with what's on the page. Total blocking time is how long is the browser told to not load anything while it loads other scripts. Hopefully that's 0. Cumulative layout shift. That's another one to look at, is how much are things changing as the page loads. So one of the things I'm sure you've seen many times before. Excuse me. So one of the things I'm sure you've seen before is when you pull up a site sometimes on your phone and you're trying to click on something, and then as an ad loads, the shape of the page changes and you click on something else, not what you meant to click on. Super obnoxious. Nobody likes it when that happens. That's called layout shift. And so one of the things that this measures is cumulative layout shift. So how much are things changing size, shape, location as the page loads? And so these are the things it's going to judge you on. And then it'll give you some recommendations based on each of these things. So it'll step through and give you specific advice. One thing that I would call out, though, is that what's important is that you get some of these numbers to be into the green. That's what's most important. It will give you advice on, here's some things you can change about your site that will be better. Those things only matter as much as they're helping you change these numbers, right? So if you've got a site that there's a lot of advice on how it could do better, but the numbers look okay, the site's fine, right? So yeah, this is GT Metrix. Check it out. It's pretty handy. You can use the free version and it'll give you everything you need. It's really, really nice. So that was the first one I wanted to show you. The second one is I wanted to show you something that you can do just in a browser, because sometimes you can't test a site on the internet. Sometimes maybe the public internet will have a coming soon page, or maybe you're developing a site that isn't public yet, and you need to be able to do tests just using your browser. So one of the things you can do is you can just use Google Chrome. And so go into, if you download Google Chrome, it's a browser, make sure you're on the latest version, which you can do by going into help and about, and it'll check to see if you're on the latest version. But once you're on the latest version, one of the things you can do is you can go over here to the menu, and under more tools, one of the options will be developer tools. So that, and that will pull this up. And then up here at the top, here, let me make this a little bigger so it's easier to see. Up here at the top, there's a number of different tools that you can use, and one of them will be Lighthouse. You'll have to look for it, but Lighthouse is here. And what you can do is you can generate a report. And there's reports that it'll do in different categories, things like SEO, accessibility. What we're going to do for this presentation is just run a report just on the performance of the site. And you can do it in mobile or desktop mode. For now, we're just going to do desktop. So I'll click Analyze, and then it will do a test where it will measure all kinds of different things about this just using your browser. It doesn't use some external service. It's really, really handy that you can kind of do all of these things, and it'll give you a score and tell you some of those same numbers as before, where we've got cumulative layout shift, total blocking time, speed index, all those types of things. And it'll give you that map. And I didn't even have to leave my browser for this. So even if I was developing this this website just on my computer, I would still be able to use this, and it's pretty handy. So that is Lighthouse. It will also give you specific recommendations, and it will rank them by how important it thinks there are. Where in this one, for example, it's saying, whoa, you've got some really big images here that you could resize. That's the same advice GT Metrix gave me, right? It says, hey, you could resize some of these images, and that would help a lot. And yeah. Also, just a quick thing, when we were talking before about those two tools, Query Monitor. So here's Query Monitor, where it will actually step through and show you how long the various queries are and which ones are taking the longest, and where different ones are coming from. And then the other one was when I go into Tools, Site Health. There's a number of tests that can happen there. So yeah. Anyways, that's something you can use that's pretty handy, and you can be able to take something from this to this, just stepping through things one at a time. Now, this isn't a real website. This is a website that I specifically made for the purposes of making a lot of performance mistakes so that I could go through, use GT Metrix and fix them. But it'll give you specific advice on what to change. And you can change things from pretty slow to pretty quick, which helps not just with speed, but also scalability. And Lighthouse will help you do the same thing. So pretty handy stuff. Some stuff to keep in mind for testing as you're going through this is keep in mind the numbers that really matter are what are referred to as core web vitals. And maybe that's something you'll want to Google, you'll want to look at, is core web vitals. It's because some numbers matter more than others. You'll see sometimes people talking about numbers like time to first byte, which is when the first byte comes back from the server. I don't actually think that's that important, not compared to core web vitals, because what core web vitals try to measure is how will your site viewers perceive the speed of your site. they won't perceive the first byte that comes back. They'll perceive when most of the content is on the page. They'll perceive how much things shift when they finally load. They'll perceive how soon they can click on things. And so by paying the most attention to cumulative layout shift, largest contentful paint, like those sorts of core web vital type metrics, and you can just Google core web vitals to take a look at what the current standards are and what the recommendations are. Those are the numbers I would pay the most attention to. And Lighthouse and GT Metrix both measure those things. The other ones are important, but not nearly as important. The reason just being that that's what's going to matter for what your customers will perceive. Another thing to keep in mind, a perfect score is not as important as a good score that doesn't take all of your time. Because you're going to want to focus on the things that will make the biggest difference with the smallest amount of effort. If every time you make a change or publish something, it takes an enormous amount of tinkering to get a good score, and you're just trying to get it from 99 to 100, it might not be actually, there's a point of diminishing return to where, like, do the things that make a big difference. And then at that point, that's when I would, once you hit a limit of when you're seeing the numbers improve, if you still need better numbers, and if you're finding that, hey, I think I could do better in the market with a faster site, that's when it might be a good idea to go with paid services like Cloudflare, where you can just upgrade your Cloudflare plan and things just get faster. Talk to your hosting provider, see if there's any recommendations they have for you. They might even have a faster plan where they could say, hey, just we've got more powerful servers available for you. We could just upgrade you, right? So it's just something to think about. And that the recommendations in those tools only matter as much as they help your speed. So yeah, just try to test things the way most visitors see your site. So maybe that's the homepage for your site. Maybe that's if most people are coming in onto a landing page, maybe test that. For e-commerce sites, make sure you test the cart, things like that. But try to test things in a way that is the most similar to how your customers will actually perceive things. Cool. And then at that point, let's see. I think there's some Q&A. So Devin, I might have to turn this over to you for the Q&A section, or at least to pull up. I think you've been aggregating some of the questions, but yeah, maybe it's time for some Q&A. By the way, while he's pulling that up, one way you can get help from Bluehost, there's these things on the screen. So there's a good thing to screenshot right there. But yeah, let's get into the Q&A.
All right, I'm back. Thank you so much. We have a handful of questions that came in, so I just want to go through a handful of those.
Okay.
Let's see. Let me pull these up real quick. And I've tried to answer a handful of the questions as they've come in.
We got a few questions. Okay, cool.
Okay, so here's your first question for you. How can I test scalability? You mentioned load testing, but I can't load test my site, right?
Okay, that's a good question. Okay, yeah. So you actually can load test your site. You just have to be careful because the most hosting providers will provide protection against attacks. And a load test usually involves sending a lot of traffic, simulated traffic, to a site to see how fast it performs. And that is the literal exact same thing as a DDoS attack when you're a server. And so if all of the traffic is coming from different locations and different IP addresses and different browsers and have different fingerprints, then it can be perceived as real traffic. But if it's all coming from the same place, it oftentimes will get perceived as an attack. So one of the things you can do is if you do any like local development where like you're running a copy of your site on your computer, sometimes it's better to load test locally, like on a computer, and then multiply your results out to real life to where, if your page load speed is normally 1 second on production and it's half a second on your computer, okay, there's your coefficient, right? And it's probably not going to be linear the way that it scales up, but it does give you a ballpark estimate. So you can load test, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend load testing your production site because you could get blocked by your hosting provider. And if your hosting provider doesn't have that protection, you might actually bring your site down temporarily.
Okay, let's see. The next one, this one, they ask, how do I reduce HTTP requests?
Oh, good question. So I'm guessing you've been looking at like either Lighthouse or GT Metrix, and that was one of the recommendations. So for that, there's two things you can do. One is if you have HTTP2 enabled, which if you have Cloudflare, you'll get that by default, then that's a little bit less important because those requests won't be blocking. So reducing the number of requests is far less important if you have HTTP2, which Cloudflare gets you. But there are plugins out there like Auto Optimize, like all one word, Auto Optimize, that will do that for you to reduce HTTP requests. Just keep in mind that the things you want to focus on are the largest contentful paint, the cumulative layout shift, the core web vitals numbers, and reducing HTTP requests only matters if it helps those numbers go up.
Okay, that's great. Next question here. Someone asked if I had a developer build my website and they're no longer in the picture. Some of this technical stuff seems a little bit over my head. What can I do?
Oh, that's a good question. Okay, so somebody else built your website, but they're not working on your site anymore, and it's now fallen to you. So this is kind of like, there's a lot of things, and some of them don't have anything to do with performance, but just like get to know your site a little bit and how it works. And I would say get a staging copy of your site. And most hosting providers are going to provide staging options, but it's basically just another copy of your site that is only for you to test with. And what you can do there is you can start just messing with stuff, start turning on and off plugins, start looking into what the different parts of it do. And you don't have to worry about breaking your real site because you're only messing with the copy. So you can do that and kind of familiarize yourself with, oh, here's how the coupons work. Okay, it's over in here, and here's how this works. And you can kind of reverse engineer things that way. And the other thing is, I recommended some plugins here that can probably help. Things like Query Monitor, things like Lighthouse testing that will help pinpoint problems even if you've never seen the site before. It'll still be able to point out, hey, this plugin is generating most of your queries, or hey, you could reduce some images sizes over here, that sort of stuff.
Awesome. This is kind of like a follow-up to that. It says, I was told to turn off plugins to make my site faster, but I need the functionality of those plugins. So what should I do?
Keep them. Keep the plugins. Like, unless they're bad plugins. But like, that's the most common advice you're going to get, and it's not bad advice. It's advice I've given to people hundreds of times, right? But like at the end of the day, your site serves a purpose. So like, maybe try to find something else that does that. That's the best thing about WordPress is also the worst thing about WordPress, which is that there's usually 10 different ways to do any one thing. So maybe see if there's another plugin out there that's better maintained. If you've got a plugin that doesn't work in the latest version of PHP, it's probably not well maintained. And I would guess that also might indicate that there might be security problems with it. But like, usually a good, well-maintained, popular plugin from WordPress.org is going to be compatible with and maybe even require the latest versions of PHP. That can be difficult, especially if you're talking about commerce side and like, oh, I've got this, this payment processor that like I have to use this specific one. It can be tricky. But see if you can find another plugin that does the same thing, that does let you switch PHP versions, because it's more than just speed. There's also security problems with using really old versions of PHP. So it's worth trying to switch. So, it's more than just turn them off. Try to maybe find a replacement for them if you can.
I think I'll add something to that as well. I think you can also use that as a troubleshooting step in the process, right? Like if you're concerned that your site is slow, it's not too difficult to go in and turn off a plugin and then check your site again, or turn off all your plugins and test your site again.
Yeah.
And if you don't see a dramatic change in the load speed, then you know that your plugins aren't the issue, and if you do see, then you can start turning them back on one at a time until you can at least localize where the issue might be coming from.
Yeah.
And then if you do determine that, hey, that I have this one plugin that's absolutely critical to my business and to my website, then you can start doing all those things that you just mentioned, Chris, where you go in and you look for maybe a different plugin that might be a little bit more well-maintained, a little bit more streamlined in its development, that doesn't take quite the bandwidth or the resources to load. But yeah, I think that's a good question. A couple more here. There was a lot of great questions. I tried to answer them as best as I could in the chat, but let's see. Breaking my site. There's been a couple questions on this theme. I'll go with this one specifically. I want to update my PHP version, but when I do, it breaks my site. So I'm struggling with the balance of increasing the speed of the load time, increasing the speed of the site versus when I do these things, it breaks my site. So
okay,
how do I fix that?
Yeah, and maybe I misheard the last question, but it sounds it's a lot of the same stuff, where like the PHP version is going to dramatically help not just the speed, but the scalability of your site. And so like if it's a contest between this plugin versus this PHP version, I'm sorry, but the PHP version wins. It's more important. You try to find another plugin that does the same thing, that works with a newer version of PHP. And if you've got some custom code in there, like maybe somebody's using like snippets or a plugin that's not on .org or something that doesn't work with the new PHP version, or a theme, sometimes older themes have this problem, see if you can find an alternative, because it's only going to get worse over time. And the sooner that you're able to get on the latest version of PHP, the sooner you're going to benefit from the security improvements, from the speed improvements, but mostly the scalability. Because even if you don't notice a huge difference in how fast the site loads when you're just loading it yourself, where what I can tell you from the server side of things, where you'll see a huge difference, is the scalability. Is, hey, how fast does the site continue to be under a lot of load? Newer versions of PHP are going to help with that, and older versions of PHP are terrible for that sort of thing.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like there's only three main reasons when a developer releases a newer update. Usually, it's one, because there is a security threat that they were detected in their software. Two, they want to add new features or something like that, which, depending on what the update is, may or may not be noticeable. Or three, they want to increase the efficiency of the platform or the tool. So
yeah, it's usually security bugs, other bugs, or or functionality. Yeah.
Okay, and I'll just add my 2 cents to that as well. Whenever you're making these updates, I would always highly recommend taking a backup first, downloading a backup, just in case your site does break. At the very least, you can restore your backup, get your site back up and running, and then you can utilize staging. You can reach out to our tech support, and we can walk you through any issues that you might run into as your site is having issues.
100%. Yeah. Do backups before making any major changes. And also, staging's great for this, where like it just lets you, then you can mess around as much as you want to with the copy without worrying about breaking your production site. And it's great for stuff like, let me just try out a completely different theme. Doesn't matter if it breaks, because it's not my real site. And then you can try all kinds of crazy stuff.
Awesome. I think we're just about at time. I've got one or two more questions that I'd love to get your thoughts on.
Okay.
Can you speak a little bit more about time to first byte, what it is, and what I can do about it? How do I improve it?
Time to first byte. That used to be a really important thing that people look at. It's not that it's unimportant. It's just that it's not what I would focus on. Um, I would focus on largest contentful paint, which is what people will perceive as the page loading, the first input delay, how soon can I click, how soon can I scroll, that sort of thing, type into forms, and cumulative layout shift, where as the page loads, things are changing size, the ads load and it pushes content down, that sort of thing. Those are the three I would pay attention to. Everything else is interesting, but ultimately customers won't directly perceive it. Customers are never going to directly perceive time to first byte. They will directly perceive the others. So it's an interesting metric. It can sometimes matter a lot more in situations where like cell phone networks and things, or if you're trying to figure out problems with like DNS latency, maybe that might be important. But the thing is, if you've got a really good LCP, first input delay, cumulative layout shift, then by necessity you will have a decent time to first byte. So Lighthouse, I think, measures that. GT Metrix definitely measures that. But honestly, I would only worry about it in as much as it matters for those three other metrics. Because what matters is what people the robots of the internet are not the important part, it's the humans. And what matters is how the humans perceive the load time.
I like it. Okay, last question, then we'll end on this one.
Okay.
I'm not a programmer. You mentioned optimizing code to increase speed time. What can I do to optimize my code?
Be picky about your plugins. Be picky about your theme. And don't be afraid to ask for help. Is what I would say. Because you can use tools like Lighthouse, GT Metrix, Query Monitor to pinpoint, okay, this plugin is maybe a problem. But let's say the plugin's like WooCommerce. And it's like, well, I definitely have to use that one because this is a store and I want it to be a WooCommerce store. I'm not putting it on Shopify, I'm putting it on WooCommerce. And all of my extensions work with WooCommerce. So yeah, that's where all the queries are, but I'm gonna keep using it. So what should I do? That's where just be picky about the plugins that you use. Try to find some stuff that gives you a decent score there, and maybe hire a developer if you absolutely need to. But oftentimes you can get really, really far with just a good hosting provider and well-reviewed, well-maintained plugins and a theme. And that's usually good enough. Oftentimes, a very heavy multi-purpose theme is kind of a problem. And so if you can get something that's lightweight and fast, a good block theme is going to be helpful to you, to where you don't necessarily have to know how to code to get a very fast site. And never hurts, I should say, to learn. So yeah.
Awesome. All right. I think we're going to end on that. Thank you so much for your time. This was super helpful. I hope it was helpful for everyone else. So if you have any further questions, drop them in the comments. We'll do the best we can to answer them via email on a follow-up. But Chris, thanks for stopping by and sharing all of your knowledge with us.
Thank you.
Talk to y'all soon.